Okay, my name's David Bailey. I'm a professor at the University of Birmingham Business School. I do a lot of work on automotive and manufacturing. I'm particularly interested in cars simply because I always have been, even as a child. But increasingly, I've come to recognise its value for the economy in terms of the number of jobs that are employed in automotive assembly and the supply chain and selling cars and finance around cars and servicing cars, which adds up to something like 850,000 people in the UK. It's also an important sector in terms of research and development, exports, boosting our balance of payments, and in providing high quality jobs. We saw, for example, what happened to the MG Rover workers. We tracked them over time afterwards, and in many cases, they went on to work in lower paying jobs in the service sector. So I'm particularly interested in automotive. It's also hugely important in terms of the transition. To try and get towards net zero, we have to decarbonise transport. Part of that is not only us walking and cycling more and using public transport, but where we do have to use cars, increasingly they'll have to be electric. So if we look at the auto industry, many governments see the auto industry as strategically important, and they will often use tariffs to protect it in some way. And under World Trade Organization rules, countries are allowed up to tariffs of up to 10% in order to sort of support their industries. Now, what's tended to happen in recent years is that there's been a bit of a trade war between the US and China in particular. Trump introduced tariffs of 25% on Chinese imports. That then went up to 27.5%, and Biden has announced that that will rise to 100% on Chinese electric vehicle imports. That's to try and protect the US industry. China has also supported its industry in many ways and has introduced various forms of tariffs. And at the moment, the European Union is investigating support subsidies for Chinese electric vehicles and may introduce tariffs later this year. So if we look at the UK at the moment, for example, there is a 10% tariff on imports, aside from that trade deal with the EU, where there's free kind of trade between the two as long as local content is met. But if you import, say, a car from China, that means a 10% tax on the car from China. China can, of course, still make cars very cheaply, and we're seeing a growth in imports from China into the UK. Now, what's tended to happen over time is as the global economy has liberalized, those tariffs up until most recently have been coming down. That has boosted trade between countries that have been making cars. So, for example, in the wake of a trade deal between the European Union and South Korea some time ago, that led to an increase of cars between the EU and South Korea, and more South Korean cars being imported into the European Union. A final point I want to make is that the auto industry isn't just about, say, the UK making a car and selling it to Germany. The supply chain, the global production network, is very intricately linked across countries. So if you look at a car that is made in the UK, many of the components will come from overseas. So take the case of Mini, for example, in the UK, made in Oxford. The engine is assembled not far from where I'm sitting in Birmingham, but the engine block will have originally come from a joint venture between BMW and Stellantis in France, comes to the UK for processing, then over to Germany for further work, then back to the UK for components to be added, and that engine may go into a Mini made in the UK or a BMW made in Germany or somewhere else. That engine could have crossed the channel 5 times before it's finally sold. So you've got these very intricate sort of supply chains that cross borders, often controlled by the assemblers or first-tier suppliers. And that was actually one of the big issues with Brexit, because it meant that managing those supply chains across borders when you introduce friction became much more difficult.